Hello everyone!
Welcome to the Danish Baking Show.
Since we can't bring you to Denmark...
Hello everybody! Welcome to the Danish Baking Show, Part 2.
You may remember that last time you couldn't be here. Because of COVID, we had to cook a virtual dish. But this time, we're here live with real ingredients and bringing the flavors we want to have. You are taking a front row seat on another episode of the Danish Baking Show. My name is Bjarke. I'm head of CMS, but during this session, just consider me your cake master.
And I'm your co-host Elitsa, a software developer in the CMS team. But for today's session, I'll be your pastry chef. I hope you've been sharpening your culinary skills with our YouTube tutorials since 2021, because today we are going to show you what's cooking in Umbraco 13 and 14. Right, here is the agenda of all the ingredients we are mixing into our presentation today. First, we'll look at how we managed to keep up to date with the latest technologies. Next, we'll share what we did to enhance composability and improve the developer experience. We'll also discuss our future direction and sprinkle in some fun facts from our telemetry data. And by the end, you'll get a version overview from our current long-term supported version, or LTS, to the next one. Oh, and before I forget, if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll have the slides ready for you to download at the end, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Now I have a question for you, Bjarke. How do we ensure our cakes stay fresh with the new tech?
That's a great question. For every cake and every product, it's important to have a solid foundation. The foundation of Umbraco is .NET. The latest two versions of Umbraco are running on .NET 8, which is a long-term supported version from Microsoft. It means we have roughly 2.5 years support left from Microsoft. .NET 8 brings performance enhancements in areas such as list, strings, and even link expressions. It also unlocks the features of C# 12, which comes with primary constructors and collection impressions, which is a thing I think can make your code more readable. We have also introduced the minimal hosting model. It was actually something Microsoft came with a couple of years ago. It tries to simplify the entry point of the application, so it condenses the two files, the program CS and the startup CS, into just a single file, program CS. It uses a lot of the latest features of C#, so there's no namespace, there's no import. It basically looks like a script nowadays. The reason we use it nowadays is it was actually a request from the community, because Microsoft have updated all their documentation to use the minimal hosting model. And many of the new features from Microsoft, like a minimal API and these things, only works with the minimal hosting model. We have also changed to use system text JSON in Umbraco 14. This is a new JSON library. Again, it was introduced a couple of years ago, but the feature set have been smaller. Microsoft expands the feature set for each release of .NET. It's a replacement to Newtonsoft JSON, which is, I guess, the most used third-party component in the .NET world. The cool thing is the original author of Newtonsoft JSON, James Newton King, he is nowadays working with Microsoft and have been involved in making this new library. It is built with performance and security in mind, so it's right down our alley, and Microsoft claims it's roughly twice as fast to serialize and deserialize and use a bit less memory. As I said, it's available in Umbraco 14.
Front-end-wise, we made sure that the login screen does not rely on any outdated technology. I'm talking about the discontinued web framework, AngularJS. This is not only a visual update, as users of Umbraco 13 now enjoy a login experience built on the latest technology. It's like getting a glimpse of version 14 while still on v13. The login screen that you see here is highly customizable, and you can easily rebrand it. Plus, this change was also the first step to modernize the Umbraco backoffice from a technological point of view. And speaking of the new back office, we've given it a fresh name. It's called Bellissima, as you can see. With this project, we are really taking advantage of the common standards now supported by browsers. And even though this is a complete rewrite of the back office, using Bellissima still feels very familiar. The back office itself is built using web components, including the UI library I just mentioned, along with TypeScript, Lit, and Vite. But you can use any technology and framework that suits your needs. And that's not all. This modern tech stack has opened up a lot of possibilities for us. Many UI-related responsibilities have now moved to the client side. There are loads and loads of extension types, far more than we had available in version 13. And thanks to TypeScript, we now have IDE support, and so on. With this update, we also retired the deprecated property editors, choosing not to port them over to Bellissima.
If you want to have more information about Bellissima, our colleague Jacob will have a full talk only about Bellissima on this stage later today. Our CEO and CTO, Kim and Philip, have been talking a lot about DXP and composability. But what does it actually mean for the CMS? Elitsa, besides baking cakes, I know you have been heavily involved in bringing native headless capabilities to Umbraco. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. We introduced the content and media delivery APIs in version 12, and Umbraco 13 already comes with some improvements through version 2 of the APIs. One of those improvements is related to output expansion. A quick recap, this feature makes it possible to retrieve data for linked content or media items in one go. For example, items that you picked using property editors that we call pickers. With this feature, you don't have to make several requests to obtain the data, first for the main item and then for the picked one. So in Umbraco 13, property expansion became possible in a nested fashion, and therefore it's no longer limited to only the first content level. With such syntax, you can specify just the properties you want to expand, and with a single API call, you can get all the data needed to serve your front-end pages. But sometimes you might end up with too much data. This is where property limiting comes into play. With the fields parameter allows us to specify just the properties we want to return in the API output, and this becomes particularly useful when querying multiple items. Syntax-wise, it looks just like property expansion. So the two main things to remember here are the following. Expandable properties are not expanded by default. You must expand them explicitly. And the other one, all properties are included in the API output by default. But you can apply limiting to tailor the output to specific use cases. If you want to boost the delivery API's performance, you can use output caching. In many cases, it might not be absolutely necessary to push content updates immediately. So we can cache the API output for you for each unique request and reuse them until the cache expires. You can opt into this feature and configure it individually for both the content and media delivery APIs. And in this example, we have explicitly enabled output caching, where the content output is cached for 15 minutes, while the media output is cached for an hour.
A next natural step when we talk about composability have been to introduce webhook management. It's actually a feature that originated in hardcore, but is now available in the open source CMS. You use webhooks to notify external systems about all kinds of events that happens in Umbraco. And this has always been possible as a C# developer, but it required custom code. So this new feature ensures that webhooks are handled in a uniformly way, and the UI allows you to create new one in a no-code fashion. It allows you to resend webhooks that have failed and access the log messages. That brings us to the management API, which is new in Umbraco 14. It's a massive API, but where the delivery APIs are working on cached data, the management API are manipulating the master data. This is the foundation of the back office, but actually also some of our test suites. And when building a new API from scratch, it gave us some opportunities to improve some things along the way.
That's right. Let's start with the topic of authentication and authorization. For many years, Umbraco has relied on the OpenID Connect protocol to support external login providers for managing authentication for both users and members. Starting with Umbraco 12, OpenID Connect was also implemented to support member authentication against the delivery API using the authorization code flow together with the PKCE mechanism. Moving on, version 13, of course, inherited this approach while maintaining a cookie-based authentication for the Umbraco users. In version 14, however, things have changed. We replaced the entire authentication process for the new back office as we now needed a token-based approach, just as we have in the delivery API. We made sure that the management API also uses OpenID Connect for both authentication and authorization. So this entire API now operates based on access tokens. Since we are adhering to standards here, a great outcome is that Umbraco still supports external identity providers, just as before. You can use the same code except for a few UI-related properties that have been moved to the client. Another exciting thing is our work on making it possible to swap our authorization handling in Umbraco. We collaborated with one of our partners, Rock Solid Knowledge, to create a strategy that allows lookup access in external systems instead of using the Umbraco permissions. We've now prepared the abstractions to enable external authorization within Umbraco. OpenID Connect allows us to use clients like Swagger and Postman. In the future, it will open up the possibilities to use the management API for integrations as well. Currently, this requires user interaction, but we expect to implement machine-to-machine authentication in version 15, which is where the client credentials feature comes in.
Since Umbraco 12, we have had Swagger available to show all the Open API specifications. The management API obviously also have a Open API specification. It's a massive one. We have 310 endpoints in the management API. The specification shows what models do we expect as input and what do we return, what kind of headers can you expect, what kind of return response codes can you expect. And Umbraco handles all these specifications. So if you're just making a default ASP.NET Core web API, web controller, then Umbraco will actually handle it, put it into a default specification, which makes sense for you when you make a client project. But it's actually also quite easy to move to a dedicated specification if you're making a package. And if you want to hear more about migrating packages to 14, Andy will be at this stage tomorrow and talk about what it takes to migrate packages to 14. The management API is built with an API-first approach. It's not just another API for the back office client, which is also why we are using tokens now. It means we have good separations, we have standard ways of doing things. One example is we have introduced configuration endpoints for all categories. This means a single setting or configuration from the app settings file can actually be reflected in multiple configuration endpoints. But it gives us the flexibility to have different authorization on each of these endpoints, and thereby ensure the flexibility. We're also working with a concept we call viewports. A viewport is just a different view into the same data. Yes, great, nice. We're back.
Yay.
I was talking about viewports. So the viewports are different views into the same data. A good example is item endpoints, which we made available. If you have access to the content, you have access to the item endpoints of all categories. So consider you have a user picker. If you have the ID of the user, you are able to get a minimal representation of the user, only the name, nothing that is secret or anything. And item endpoints works across all categories. But we are also using viewports for collections. We're using it for the recycle bin trees and even more. All endpoints in the new management API that returns lists are now paged, even those where we can't imagine it will ever be necessary. We went with the skip and take pattern because it brings the most flexibility over the page number and page size. But keep in mind, our service layer is often still using page number and page size, so the numbers currently need to be translatable. But we did it this way to avoid future breaking changes in the management API, where we can introduce the flexibility. One thing we had to reimagine when building an API and an API-first approach was profiling. It used to be in the upper right corner of back office, where you could see what happened during the request. We are using a third-party component called Mini Profiler, and luckily, this component actually had a solution for API-first approaches. It is a dedicated endpoint where it watches all endpoints called, both Umbraco endpoints, but also your custom ones, also the delivery API. And then you can dive into each of them to see, like in this case, where I used the collection viewport of the media, I can see what SQL have actually been executed and whether I can optimize anything.
Another significant change in version 14 is migrating away from the integer identifiers for entities. This means that we are no longer exposing the database-owned entity IDs and instead using GUIDs across all our endpoints. As a result, API clients now have the ability to specify the desired ID when creating new items, which opens up the possibilities for the future. Let's talk about the famous save and publish. In Umbraco 14, our management API features clearly defined atomic operations, each responsible for its specific task and dataset. As a result, certain endpoints have been divided to reflect that. We want them to make sense from a transactional point of view. Either they succeed or roll back. Take, for example, the save and publish action on documents from version 13 and below. You can save a document that isn't valid yet for publishing, perhaps because it is still a work in progress. In such cases, although the save operation could succeed, the subsequent publish operation could fail. So from an API perspective, we divided the saving action into separate create and update endpoint alongside with a separate publish endpoint for documents, for example. And on that note, Bjarke, why don't you give us a taste of what we have done architecture-wise to improve the developer experience?
Sure. First of all, we have moved a lot of business logic from our controllers into the service layer. We actually now have slim controllers. They're only responsible for doing things that are related to web, no business logic. This shows a typical example of a controller in the management API. It has a single action. The plan is to only have a single action unless we have multiple versions of that specific endpoint. We only inject what is needed for exactly that action. And when we had to move the logic into the service layer, we used the opportunity to have async services, and we had to come up with a way to communicate all the expected possible outcomes back, not only the happy path. So we went with an attempt pattern, which had been in Umbraco for years, which returns both the result and a status. So in this case, where it is a delete data type, it's expected that sometimes if you have an ID we don't know, it's a not found. It's also expected that some data types are not deletable. And in theory, you could have custom code that cancels the operation from a notification handler. All this is not exceptions. We expect that. So it's communicated back in a nice way. We are handling all these things, all these statuses, and convert them into web responses in the base controller. So we reuse the statuses for an entire category like data types. And thereby we can reuse it and hide that in the base controller. But again, it's only things related to web. You can think, what's in it for me? But the thing is, it actually makes it way easier to work with Umbraco from a programmatic point of view. Because now our service layer is handling all the logic, and it's very hard to persist stuff that is not valid anymore. Let's talk about the future. Elitsa, can you reveal what's currently in the cooking in the oven?
Let me see. Definitely blocks. We've been focusing on blocks in the past. We have a bunch of property editors like BlockList and BlockGrid that use blocks already. And we are looking to add even more flexibility, more block functionality in Umbraco down the line. Plus, in version 13, we introduced blocks in the rich text editor, which meant we could say goodbye to macros for good. Soon, we'll also start working on block level variations. Our goal is to open up more possibilities for multilingual sites and personalized content within blocks. With block level variations, we'll keep the structure of the block editor consistent across all variants, but each variant can have its specific property data depending on the variant. Also, we have an RFC about global blocks. We are seeing a chance to add even more flexibility and make it easier to reuse and maintain block content in general, so stay tuned.
Last year I started talking about we want to be able to run Umbraco without having all content in memory at all time. We call it lazy loaded content or lazy loaded published content. The first step is to untangle the business logic from the management API and the service layer. We already started, so XPath have been deprecated in 13 and removed in 14. XPath are relying only on the published cache. It requires everything to be in memory. We have introduced features like the dynamic routes, which are solving some of the use cases that didn't have alternatives. Others already have alternatives. If you want to do a 404 page, we have the last chance content finders instead of the configurations with an XPath, and so on. A cool thing is Microsoft are bringing a new library in .NET 9, which helps with hybrid caches. So it's extensions to the distributed cache abstractions, and we plan to use those. The benefits should be faster boot times and less memory consumption on these massive sites with a lot of content.
We don't know how many of you have tried our cake recipes, but luckily, we have some telemetry data from Umbraco. Bjarke, why don't you give us a slice of that?
Sure. Let's start with some fun facts. Remember, we only have numbers from latest 8 and up. We are seeing a trend. More sites are reporting in detailed, so we have more numbers. If we look at the slides, one site have reported more than 300,000 content nodes. Another site have reported more than 500,000 members, while the average is only 800. But what surprised me the most is one site is reporting more than 2,000 assigned domains. This is really why all our endpoints is now paged, because we can't foresee how you use Umbraco, apparently. If we dive into some of the numbers, the left diagram shows all the sites reporting in detailed telemetry, and the right one shows only what we determine as being production. We don't have a silver bullet to do that. I use the ASP.NET Core environment and look if it's production or called prod or live or something. We assume it's production. Hosting environments, interestingly, around 92% are hosting on Windows. If we look at the total number, we see around 1% are using Mac. The numbers are a bit higher than last year for hosting on Windows. Maybe it's due to more sites reporting. Maybe it's just a trend. We don't know that. Last year I also talked about runtime modes, which was introduced, I think, in Umbraco 10 or something. Back then, 95% still used the default mode called back office. This year, we see around 85% still using the back office mode. I would really recommend to use production in production. If you are a real developer, you are doing your stuff on compile time, then we can disable a lot of features that are not necessary, just bringing better performance. It's also interesting to look at how many sites is actually using deprecated property editors, like the nested content and the grid layout. And we see around 42%, 43%. That's quite a bit more than last year. Maybe it's just because more sites are reporting. I really hope so. Don't hope you start new projects and use those properties that are marked as deprecated and not ported to 14. The last insight I have is how many sites are using either the block list or the block grid. Now we see 80% sites are using either of those. That's much more than last year. It was 44% last year. But again, it could be just more sites reporting. But at least that's a trend we like.
We've been through a lot of cool topics that you can use in Umbraco 13 and 14. But can you actually remind us, how long are we keeping these cakes in the store?
Sure. We will have Umbraco 13 available until November 26. Same as .NET 8 when it goes out of support. Umbraco 14 have standard supports, so it will be available for 1 year. But we also have new cakes incoming. Umbraco 15 will be available in November this year, together with .NET 9. Umbraco 16 will be available in June next year. And Umbraco 17 will be available in November next year, together with .NET 10, which is also a long-term supported version. If you're interested in what are we looking into features to these versions, Lasse will have a full talk about this on this stage tomorrow.
So there you have it. You've got two different cakes, Umbraco 13 and Umbraco 14, two great flavors. As always, it depends on the project. There are good reasons for using both versions. But the next time you're deciding which one to choose, you can hopefully remember that version 13 is like Grandma Classic. It's familiar, it tastes delicious, and it will be around for longer. While if you're constantly developing new things, you'll go with 14. It's newer, it's fresher, like a modern restaurant cake. So pick the one you prefer, and remember, version 13 or 14. It's all about taste. Thank you.